I want to show you today what has worked really well for me. And the first thing that has really worked for me is making sure before I do anything else is the folding the paper pattern on the sew lines. This really helps me as I keep sewing and then keep adding pieces of fabric to this pattern. Once I have the crease already folded, it allows me to move faster and quicker. So let's do that first. And I use this, it's just a cardboard from a notebook paper. The idea is to just have something really thin but a little bit more sturdy than the paper you're working with, so it allows you to make your creases. The other thing to remember is your pattern is always facing up towards you, whereas your first piece of fabric that you're putting in is pretty side down. And then any subsequent fabric that you add is the fabric is going to be pretty sides together but always opposite to the paper. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Once you have that down, every pattern pretty much follows the same system, even though they may be named differently or numbered differently. And so I'm going to put in A1 first, and A1 and A2 are going to be one seam that's going to connect these two. So let me show you how that's done. First, because I don't like to waste a lot of fabric, I'm pretty stingy about putting a big piece of fabric and then having to cut it and then wasting that fabric. What I try to do is use a pin to hold my piece of fabric in place, because what happens is when I turn it over, then I can really look at if that piece of fabric is going to cover the entire pattern or that section of the pattern appropriately. And because this is a directional fabric that I have, and in this particular case I want to try and at least keep the directionality a certain way. Usually I don't really care about directional fabrics, I just be more cautious about the directionality, and so I'm being extra careful as to how I place it. And then notice here, your pattern is facing you. The pattern and the first bit of fabric is against each other, so they're wrong sides together. But the fabric and the second piece of fabric are pretty sides together. So that's a good way of remembering it. And just first pin the paper pattern to the first layer of fabric, and then when I'm placing the second layer of fabric to attach it to my first layer, I put the second pin. So when I turn it over, I'm able to estimate without having to sew and then having to rip my seam, that this is going to cover, these two pieces of fabric are going to cover the sections that I need them to cover. So we've going from A1 to A2, and those are the two sections we're joining right now, right? And this is what the other side looks like, or section of the pattern is covered by your fabric, and you want to double check both fabrics. Next thing we want to do is go from A2 to A3, and so that piece is going to be my saffron piece. And so the same thing as before, I like to do is kind of estimate where my line is, where I'm going to sew, and test with my pin to see if it'll cover. And if it doesn't, I need a different piece of fabric. And again, I don't like to waste fabric, but sometimes you're just gonna have to go with a bigger piece that you have in order to be able to cover this side. Okay, so let me show you. So I know my fabric has to go right sides together, and it's opposite to the paper pattern. Okay, so I have that, so I'm going to put this here, and then I'm going to put a pin on the line between A2 and A3. If I do that, that's going to give me an idea of whether my piece of orange fabric that I have is going to cover this section, and in this case it does not cover it. So if you can see it here, see I have this little piece that's not going to be able to cover it. So that means that I need a bigger piece, and so this is how the pin is helpful, because before you start sewing you actually now know that you need a bigger piece of fabric. So you could try it with all your pieces of fabric that you have, and again, you know, some people don't mind that they're using up their fabric. I'm kind of stingy that way with my fabric because I feel like I need to preserve as much as I possibly can for some unknown reason. One day I'm going to use it for some magical project, but it's a bit of a personal preference. And so again, this is not going to fit, so I was trying another piece of fabric that's a little bit bigger. So then finally I have this big piece which I know is going to fit. And a lot of times if you're a beginner, I would definitely recommend that you use bigger pieces until you're comfortable with it, and then you can kind of whittle down the size of the fabric that you're using to cover that. Okay, so I know this is going to definitely cover it, so I don't need to put a pin here. I'm just going to go to my sewing machine and get to sewing. A piece that we're going to do to get to attach so that we can have half our kite ready. So here again I have a little tiny piece of fabric, and so I want to make sure with my pin that it is going to, before I start sewing, going to cover this whole section. The little piece is now sewn. One of the things I wanted to point out to you here is that I always sew a little bit past the pattern. It just allows me to have the precision, and when I tear this paper out, it gives me a little bit of extra to tug and pull. The other thing is I always take a back stitch here when I am finished with this seam, so that when I'm pulling, that seam is secure. So okay, now I'm gonna flip this, and I've already ironed this seam, and so this is my half of a kite. So when you have two of these pieces, so this is your B piece and then you'll have your A piece, you join them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you're then going to get your whole kite. And so let's show you the reveal.